Hey folks, it's David with Streaming Relativity, home of the Astro DNA Observatory. Okay, today we are going to do a deep dive on the ZWO ASI2400MC Pro full frame, one-shot color, large pixel camera. And we're going to cover all the important specifications, the ones that you should be considering when you're looking at full frame cameras. We'll install it as part of my StellarView SVX90T rig. We'll deploy it to the observatory. I'll take some calibration frames, and we'll of course go over first light with this camera. And this is an awesome camera. I mean that. I really do like this camera, but it is unique. And you know what? Frankly, it's not very popular for one reason or another. That doesn't make it a bad camera. It just means that there's not a lot of user content out there on the web discussing, the performance of this camera. And I'm hoping that I'm going to fill that void with this video. So if you're into astronomy, you're into all things astrophotography, you like this kind of content, go ahead, hit the subscribe button. It's somewhere down there. And throw me a like, add some comments. I love that kind of feedback, and it helps keep me motivated. So with that, it's time for a deep dive. Okay, so who should be looking at the ASI2400MC Pro? Anybody who owns a telescope that can cover a full-frame sensor should consider a full-frame camera. Now, it's called a full-frame camera because it has the area of the sensor is the equivalent of a 35 millimeter film frame. So it's physically around 36 millimeters by 24 millimeters, and that means it has a diagonal of 43.3 millimeters. So the telescope needs to have an image circle of at least 44 millimeters if it's going to illuminate the entire frame. Now, image circle is not something that is commonly published by telescope manufacturers for one reason or another, so you'll have to check with them and do a little bit of research to determine whether or not your telescope will handle a full frame. In my case, the StellarView SVX90T, StellarView makes it very clear that it does cover a full frame. So the image circle is going to be 44 millimeters or greater. Now, on the other hand, telescopes like SCTs, for example, like my C11 and my C8, well, they do not cover a full frame sensor. In fact, they're about, without the reducer, they're about 27 millimeters, which means that they can cover an APS-C or a crop sensor, and even that there's a little bit of vignetting on the sides. Another reason is that you're looking to save a little bit of money on gear, and this has to do with the one-shot color side of this. OSC cameras, one-shot color cameras, are generally cheaper than their mono counterparts, but there's more to it than that. With a one-shot color camera, you can definitely save some bucks relative to your filter support. So you don't have to use filters at all with the one-shot color camera. However, if you are going to be using the one-shot color camera with deep sky objects, you're going to want to introduce what we would call a multi-band pass filter. It could be a dual narrowband filter, such as a HA03 filter, or there are tri-band filters as well. So with the example that I'm providing here for the APS-C camera, you're saving $500 on the camera alone, and you're saving about $1,000 in filters. That's $1,500 that can be deployed to, quite frankly, a telescope. The third reason that you would go with a camera like the ASI2400MC Pro is that you can save a lot of time and simplify your workflows. That, again, is a function of the one-shot color side of this formula, but there's also some specific features about the ASI2400MC Pro that further this case, and we'll talk about more of that later. But just keep in mind that when you're using a one-shot color camera, it really is a kind of point-and-shoot experience. When you contrast that with a mono camera, with mono cameras, you're shooting individual channels, as much as 7 channels. Think about that. I have in my filter wheel, I have 7 filters. I have the IR UV cut filter. So you have your red, your green, your blue. These are your broadbands. And then you've got your narrow bands, your HAs, your O3s, and your S2s. And that's right there, you're at 7 filters. And you need to recognize that every filter in your rig results in more time in your capture session, more time in your processing workflow. Not only is it more time, it's generally a bit more complicated as well. And some of us are looking for the most efficient workflow possible, and rather they'd spend their time capturing more objects in the night sky than more time on a single object. Okay, so if you've got a telescope that can cover the frame and you're looking for a cost-effective, highly efficient alternative for capturing images, take a look at full-frame one-shot color cameras like the ASI2400MC Pro. Okay, let's go through the features and specifications of the ASI2400MC Pro camera, and we'll get a better appreciation for where it has strengths and where there are limitations. So this camera is a full-featured, dedicated astrophotography camera, and it's in the Pro packaging, ZWO Pro packaging, and that means it's going to have all the things that, all the bells and whistles that you really want in your astronomy camera. You know, starting with the fact that the sensor, this is an IMX 410 sensor, is a backlit sensor, and that means that there's 0 amp glow. We'll get into the specs of that sensor in just a bit. In addition, you know, you're going to have features like two-stage cooling, which is going to allow you to get to a delta 35 degrees Celsius in terms of ambient temperature to the temperature of the camera. That will come in handy. This camera actually does have reduced dark currents as you get cooler and cooler down to negative 20 degrees Celsius. So it also has a dew heater built in, so that's a very convenient feature. You'll have to check your software. Nina supports the ability to turn the dew heater on, so check your software to see if it can take advantage of that capability. It is a USB 3 a camera. You would expect that because it is generating 24 megapixel images. So USB 3 is the main data transfer, and it's backed with a 512 megabytes of DDR3 memory on board, so it's it can get to about 13 frames per second. You'll probably never be utilizing it at that frame rate for deep sky astrophotography, but that is what it is capable of. In addition, there are 2 USB ports into which you can connect your accessories like your filter wheel, if you're using one, your focuser, and perhaps a rotator, or even, you know, a guide camera if that's what you're doing. So, you know, it does have all the data connections that you would expect. Obviously, it's going to come with all the cables and adapters that you need for typical optical train setups. It's highly compatible with the ZWO ecosystem and others. And, of course, there's a soft case to store this in when you're not using it with your rig. So it's everything that you would expect capability-wise from a Pro camera. Build quality, I'll just add, is excellent, which I find typical of ZWO components. Okay, now we get into the heart of it. We're going to talk about the specifications of this, starting with the sensor. So ZWO, like many astrophotography camera companies, use Sony sensors for their implementations. So I grabbed a chart of what Sony offers, and this is laid out by format as well as resolution, which are the two things that you'll consider when you're buying a camera. And you should note that ZWO has 2 camera offerings right now, or at least color camera offerings in the full frame format, and each is using a different one of these sensors. So the ASI2400MC Pro camera, that's using the IMX 410 sensor, and then the ASI2400, both their color and their monochrome editions, are using the IMX 455 CMOS sensor. Now, because these are full-frame sensors, they have the same exact physical size. The sensor area is the same, but the pixel size is different for each of these cameras, and therefore they exhibit different resolutions and other performance characteristics that vary because of that implementation. And so, since, you know, these are the 2 color full frame offerings that are out there today from ZWO, I think it'd be worth just doing a comparison, a side-by-side comparison, because I think that's what most consumers are doing when they're deciding on which full frame one-shot color camera they should buy. So let's just do that. Okay, so we have the 2400MC and the 6200MC, two full frame cameras from ZWO, different resolutions. The 2400MC has a 5.94 micron pixel, which is a lower resolution than the 6200MC, which has a 3.76 micron pixel, and that resolution is expressed in a horizontal and vertical pixel array. So 6072 by 4042 versus 9576 by 6388. Appreciable difference in resolution. But what does that mean in terms of suitability for any given rig? I intend to use these full frame cameras with my refractors. I have 3 refractors. The William Optics Zenith Star 61. It's a 360 millimeter focal length refractor. Given the aperture of the telescope and the Rayleigh criterion, this instrument can ideally get down to 2.24 arc seconds of resolution. Of course, that assumes perfect seeing, and nobody has perfect seeing. Seeing by me as measured by full width half maximum of the stars is probably somewhere between 2 and 4, and gee, it can get as bad as 5 out here. So if we use the Nyquist theorem, and we're going to get a range of about 1.12 to 2.5 arc seconds as the sampling range we need to be in. How does the IMX410 stack up? Well, it undersamples terribly on this scope. That combination results in a resolution of 3.4 arc seconds per pixel, and that is well over 50% above our worst case scenario. So I would say the 24MC is not well suited for this wide field refractor, this 360 millimeter focal length. Now the 6200MC, on the other hand, is probably acceptable because it gets down to about 2.15 arc seconds. So you see what we're doing here. We're going to apply that same analysis now to the stellar view. Okay, the stellar view is 90 millimeter aperture, so we're looking at an ideal sampling range of 0.77 arc seconds to 2.5 arc seconds. So the 2400MC Pro actually is acceptable here. It's a little bit undersampled, but I think undersampling isn't a crime, and the results are actually pretty good here. I do believe the 6200MC Pro would make a better camera for the Stellarvue SVX90T under good conditions. This is a 1.44 arc seconds of resolution, and that can produce some really nice images that are very flexible in processing. Once we get to the Astrotech with the 115 millimeter aperture and 644 millimeter focal length, we are in a sweet spot for, I think, both of these cameras at, ideally, 0.6 arc seconds to 2.5 arc seconds of sampling. And, when we look at the 2400MC, it's achieving 1.9, which is right there, hitting right in the center of the range-ish. And I think that's perhaps just a nudge towards the undersample side. And then you take the 6200MC, and we're down at 1.2 arc seconds of resolution, and that maybe we're at the nudge of oversampling. In fact, 3.76 micron pixels. I think 2600 Pro has a similar pixel size, and at times I do see a little bit of oversampling with the Astrotech. So very interesting. This camera 2400MC I think would work well with both the Stellarvue and the Astrotech. And if I do add a 6-inch refractor to the lineup, I think it's going to be spot on, that 5.94 micron pixel size. Okay, we've covered the sensor and most of the capabilities of the camera. That's just going to leave 4 very important performance characteristics: quantum efficiency, the full well capacity, the read noise, and the analog to digital converter. And we're going to cover them in order, in that exact order. And so that means we'll start with quantum efficiency. And most of these chips have graphs associated with them, but quantum efficiency is just the capability of the sensor to convert photons to electrons. And ZWO claims a peak of 80% efficiency. And be careful, when they show these graphs, they're showing the relative performance of each of the channels, RGB. And so G being 100% of the 80% quantum efficiency, whereas blue might be 80% of that 80%. So it could be a little bit misleading if you're not careful. But that tells us how efficient this sensor is relative to photon to electron conversion. And it matches the performance of the ASI2400 as well. Okay, the photons hit the pixels, and the pixels convert them to electrons, and those electrons are stored as a charge in a well. So every pixel has a well. The ASI2400MC Pro has a well with a capacity of 100,000 electrons. That is a deep well. That's actually twice the depth of the ASI6200, and this is important. Basically, it gives you a greater dynamic range. It minimizes the chances of saturation from very bright stars. It gives you lots of control over your exposure times, and ultimately it results in a higher signal-to-noise ratio. Now, it is very common to talk about well depth relative to gain. Not because there is a direct relationship between the well depth of a sensor and gain. That's actually not true. The well depth, regardless of what this graph is showing, the full well capacity is 100,000 electrons and always will be. But if we look at the gain, let's take a look at gain. Understanding gain is really important. Gain is the amplification of the analog signal represented in the well prior to the ADC converting that signal to ADUs. At gain 0, there is no amplification, and therefore it will take 6 electrons to generate 1 ADU, which makes perfect sense because this camera has a 14-bit analog to digital converter. 2 to the 14th is 16,384. 100,000 divided by 16,384 is roughly 6 and change electrons. So each ADU, each of the 16,384 ADUs represents a little more than 6 electrons in the well when operated at gain 0. At unity gain, a gain of 158, each ADU is represented by 1 electron in the well. So that's kind of like a 6 times amplification of signal. And so if we have 16,384 ADUs, 1 electron per ADU, that means that we've effectively cut the well depth down to 16,384 electrons. So as gain increases, the effective well depth decreases, and so does the dynamic range. Of course, it's not that simple, though. The actual calculation of dynamic range is log 2 of the ratio of the full well capacity, the effective full well capacity, over the read noise at the chosen gain. So at a gain of 0, we have 100,000 electrons divided by a read noise of roughly, call it 6.4, and you take the log base 2 of that number, and you're going to get something around 14. And notice that as gain is increasing, as we saw earlier, the effective full well capacity of the pixels is dropping. But notice also that so is the read noise. Now, it doesn't drop dramatically until it hits a very specific gain, which is a gain of 140, which we call the high conversion gain threshold. ZWO automatically converts the camera into high conversion gain mode at that gain setting. They call it magic, but the net result of it is that there's the way that they are reading out the analog pipeline, the signal from the analog pipeline, is changed in such a manner that it greatly reduces the read noise. So this dramatic drop in read noise makes up for the loss of effective full well capacity at this gain number. So you see this sudden spike back up to nearly 14 stops of dynamic range at this key gain setting of 140. So very interestingly, you can use this very specific gain setting to kind of bifurcate like your use cases for this camera. I use 140 because of this high gain conversion dynamic range bump for dimmer targets where you don't necessarily have a large dynamic range, not a large spread in the intensity values of your pixels, but they are very faint, and so you want to have efficient exposure times for that object. For cases where you might have very bright images along with a wider range of brightness in your objects, maybe it's a star cluster, it could be a globular cluster, it could be a very bright galaxy, you would perhaps consider taking advantage of the full well at gain 0, so 100,000 electrons, so you can actually expose the object for greater time with less risk of saturation. So these charts are very important, and they help you understand how to use your camera. Okay, folks, you guys have been so patient. There's only one last spec to talk about, and that is the analog to digital converter on these cameras. On the ASI2400MC Pro, it is a 14-bit ADC, and that's going to result in 16,384 shades of gray. On the 6200, you have a 16-bit ADC, which is going to result in 65,000 and change ADUs, or shades of gray. And what I will point out is that on screen there is an illustration of those shades, and the human eye is only capable of differentiating about 512 shades. Now, having said that, it is very good to have that level of bit resolution. Software can take advantage of it, and you probably can unlock processing capability in the future that you won't be able perhaps to do with 14 bits. So, but in practicality, when it comes to printing your photos or viewing them on screen, there's no real advantage to the 16 bits. I will also point out that the file sizes are much larger with 16-bit than they are with 14-bit. You're talking a difference between 23 or 24 megapixels and 60 to 65 megapixels. And then finally, the premium that you're paying for the 6200, you're at around $3,800 or $3,900 from ZWO. I will point out that the 2400MC Pro can be had for the ZWO version for around $3,000, but there are other manufacturers out there where I have seen this camera for as low as $2,100. So there's a lot to consider here, but you should consider yourself completely up to speed. Okay, now that you know everything about this camera, let's talk about installing it. So I had to get my stellar view out of the observatory, get it on the bench, and then, whoom, rotate it right off of that reducer. And then, whoom, had to rotate the rotator off of the filter wheel. And then I had to take apart the filter wheel. And you'll have to do this too, because the way you connect your camera to the filter wheel is through some screws on the inside. There are two that you can access from a open filter circle, and then the other you need to remove a screw that holds it on a bearing, and then you'll notice that there were two screws that need to come out. You also have to remove the tilt plate from the camera, and here I'm just removing it off of the new one and securing it back onto the ASI2400mm Pro. And there you go. You can see how you retighten the screws and retighten down on that bearing. Not too tight, otherwise that filter wheel won't spin. And then, get it back onto your reducer, put it in the observatory, get it nice and balanced, make sure everything is working well. It's always a little tricky. And once you know you've got it balanced, you are good to go. And that evening I set up and got ready to capture a bunch of data on a pretty cool target out there in Cygnus. It's the inchworm cluster, for those that have never heard of it. I chose it because I knew it was going to generate a really big red nebula, and I was curious with some of the brighter stars how the ASI2400MC Pro camera would perform with the 540mm focal length of the stellar view. Okay, so I set the gain to 140 so that the high conversion gain mode would kick in, and I did about 37 exposures at 120 seconds, gain of 140. I used an offset of 25, and I was using the L Extreme filter. Strong signal in the subs, maybe a little bit of saturation in Sadir. Okay, it was time to stack those 37 subs, and I used Zero. I created one stack with no calibration frames, a second stack with calibration frames, and a third stack with calibration and equalization. Those were then pulled into PixInsight, and I did a very straightforward processing. I mean, very straightforward. It's so much easier with one-shot color. Did a background extraction, went ahead and plate solved, image solved each of the stacks. I did that because I wanted to see what would happen if I did photometric color calibration, and so that kind of balanced out the signal a little bit better. And then I went ahead and I just did a noise exterminator, literally with default settings, I think. And I even tried a little blur extermination, but I really just wasn't happy with the results. So I skipped blur extermination completely and just went right to an auto stretch, and then I exported. And here we go. You can see all three stacks are being shown here very quickly, and I just switched over to the final stack. And this was a calibrated stack with an auto stretch and very little processing. I just fixed that one star. And from here we can take a tour and just see how well that this camera performed with the StellarView SVX90T. I am far from disappointed with this image. This is my first full frame camera image, first one-shot color image, first time processing one-shot color, and you know what? Not bad at all. I'll plan to spend more time with this camera on a couple of different rigs. I'll do more videos, and we'll learn and figure this out together. Okay, folks, let's call that a wrap. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you got something from it. If you did, please go ahead and subscribe. Hit the like button. Drop a comment for me. All of that is appreciated. In fact, why don't you go ahead and hit notifications? That way you will get a message when my next video comes out. And I plan to be releasing a video on a planetary configuration with the C11. That is the next rig to go into the observatory, and the SVX90T is going to be going on the road. That's right, I'm taking it to a dark site, and I will be taking the ASI2400MC camera with it. So please go ahead, hit notifications. And with that, I will see everybody on the next video.